Hello everyone, today we talk about the establishment of the Jubilee for plenary forgiveness and the importance of the itinerary of the seven holy basilicas of Rome that we will surely also make some video for, given their individual importance, and really not just for the relics that are contained in them, but just considering the history of the city of Rome that in itself is this universal shrine of infinite wealth and power, spiritually wise, but also well exemplified by all the riches that were in this sense tributed to the holiness of the herbs. As you know, on Schwerpunkt we made lots of videos about the history of medieval Rome. We will continue doing so. It is not just about the medieval millennium, but also the modern contemporary era of the city, as we'll see partly today, are really crucial for the tradition that developed, not just as a starter in classical times that we also make, of course, like ancient Roman history on. And we will surely probably also about as we already did, about the history of the city. If you're interested in this, I have made a video that is called The History of the Urbs, which is meant to actually be a sort of touristic guide for Rome, right? Because I'm really intentioned, and in many ways all the videos I make about European history and beyond, wherever, we arrive with Schwerpunkt historically, in the sense chronologically and geographically, it's always for the purpose of sensitizing people towards the importance of, say, history in the way it can be really experienced. The meaning of places is really crucial. I made a video about the traditional meaning of space and its metaphysical notion, and this year, because of the Jubilee that is so dense, given also the passing of Pope Francis and the election of Pope Leo XIV, are really necessary as a cornerstone for understanding why the whole thing really was born in Rome, right? And we will talk, if anything, also about the Ark of Janus. We will talk more about the meaning of the fasces, how this intertwined with the saying Christian cross. So it's something that at some point takes an almost esoteric and metaphysical to the limit of earthly rarefaction character. Almost it's lost in the in the original, like the ancestral meaning of the same. But there is also a tradition that continues and that builds up over time, that cannot be forgotten, for the simple reason that not just it's more recent, but it is also what tradition is today on top. Sometimes also, again, one can discuss whether this represents, it just goes in parallel with the decline of time. And so we know that the same spiritual shifts across the millennia are basically designed by the tradition holders, so to say, to fix the specific issues that occur to humanity in this constant decline. This is not mostly what we're going to focus on, because of course traditional purpose is always the one to not just to preserve but to reactivate, right? To almost, in fact, invert the this process of degeneration, and ideally the same one of the fall. All these theological concepts are at least clear to us from our pretty hefty history of religion playlist to this point, and I'm glad to have created last year. Going back on today's topic, so essentially we stopped, because this is part of a duo, like we stopped in that video about the properly the Roman basilicas, the original ones probably from Roman times, how they were christened and basically become in the herbs specifically, and but not only. Of course, given that Rome had made a city what before was the world, to cite the famous statement by Rutilius Nomatianus. We looked at the so-called itineraria, which was the Latin term for properly itineraries. So essentially the iter is the path, and so the notion, of course, in a world where you don't have satellitary maps, is mostly following a path, station after station, that of course was all clothed with that broader purpose and meaning. We talk about pilgrimage in our medieval history videos. We will have to come back on this, but of course traveling to Rome for Westerners, and not only, was a matter of recognizing her centrality, which was never even officially already used up until basically the last couple of centuries, and in an even informal, unofficial way, because we arrived to the point of properly not even understanding what tradition is anymore, not really dismantling it on purpose, even though that also happened to some extent. If you actually are aware of tradition, you can't resist it, so it actually also mirrors that fall from tradition, but that's another problem. Surely we will talk about the more recent history of the papacy, which is very interesting. I already made multiple videos, including about another Leo the 12th. But again, we will cover all popes, all right, in the history of the papal states, not just the one of Rome, that is, however, privileged in this sense. So we have seen notoriously how, just like actually during the ancient era, throughout the Middle Ages, travel was frequently perilous and consistently grueling due to the limitations of communication. Yet these journeys persisted without interruption until a fatal year that we are also into in the cyclical repetition effect of the Jubilee. We're talking 1300 when this was established, this tradition was established. In fact, in that year, Pope Boniface VIII, 1294-1303, inaugurated the first one, the Jubilee, as the offer of plenary indulgence, complete forgiveness of sins, to the pilgrims who journeyed to the Eternal City to venerate the tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul, that with their martyrdom indicated Rome as in itself as the seat of the Catholic Church, for what Catholic really meant in the Roman Empire in the age of, well, not Augustus anymore, but given that Christ had been born under his reign, we know very well, like essentially the foundation for the revival of the golden, or at least the preservation of the golden age, until Christ's second coming and the clash of end times. Now, a word about Boniface VIII. If you check on the internet, we've seen it many times. Essentially, papal history is often dealt with as a meme of some sort, right? Pope Boniface VIII is the evil guy of the situation. I, over the years, found so many people on Facebook history, so-called history groups, literally barking at the wind, pretending that this guy was essentially a monster of some sort, and you will still find, like in those YouTube videos that for some reason never talk about actual papal history or papal history in general, saying who was the most evil pope, etc. We never made, oddly enough, a video about, well, I think we may have done it in the very early days of Schwerpunkt about Boniface VIII, but it's just a figure that deserves so much more, right? Tens of videos or more. He was actually one of the greatest pontiffs of the Middle Ages. He was an incredibly capable, intelligent, and also practical man who displayed an incredibly strong mind and sense of vision and sense of primacy of the church in the world. Most of the reason why we think ill of him, or at least some people, generally speaking, want to characterize him in a negative light, is not even, well, it's not even Dante himself, and as you know, the problems that the poet had with the Pope, but the colonnades and French propaganda that, by the way, chapeau to propaganda when it works historically, was very intense, was essentially the alter ego of the same papal one. Those were the years of the clash, not between the Pope and the Emperor, but let's say who was the actual emperor at the time, the Pope and the King of France, Philip the Fair, Philip IV, that we also have to really look at in so much, in greater detail. You know what the clash was about? It was literally about the Roman title, right? Pope Boniface VIII, just like Philip IV, claimed for themselves the title of Caesar, right? All were, Holy Roman emperors were a bit out of the equation, and they would have come back asking for the title still. In any case, you can understand the hatred, and even though these powers were formally allies, by the way, the French and the papacy at this point were just one thing in terms of political, it's international alignment, but the investiture controversy, evidently in a broader sense, had not been over, right? And just the fact that a pope could claim properly an imperial Roman title is actually incredibly important, because it raises some theological questions that are very far from being simple to interpret, meaning that there was some actual right to that imperium at the time, and not just because of the territorial extension of the papal political power, it's temporal one. In any case, the Rome of Boniface VIII is also the one of the peak of the great medieval civilization. These are literally the years of greatest prosperity, power, fame, and wealth of Europe, of Western civilization, of the Catholic Empire of Rome. So we have to seriously look at this with admiration. We will come back surely on it as far as history of art is properly concerned. Like, there are some masterpieces in Rome made in this era that are paralleled also by the ones in the rest of Europe. This is a moment of also enormous sense of universal power, right? And this is mirrored, in fact, by the aims of the same Boniface VIII. I made a video about the Italian Trecento, which talks about, if anything, also Avignon, but also Rome in the meanwhile. So it embraces different decades that here unfolded. There is Tuscany in between, and so it's an interesting video though, because it talks about the interconnection between mostly the, especially the capitals of the great French papal Guelph Neapolitan alliance of the era. It was, again, the greatest power in Western Eurasia. Now, at the outset of the Jubilee of 1300, it again was an absolute novelty, right? Evidently aimed at properly giving a traditional rhythm to, like, a generational, every 25 years, as you know, this repeats itself, renovation, because this is what really the rejuvenation, the being born once again, not just into Christ, but into Rome, as you literally had to make your pilgrimage there. It was all one with the fundamental imperial Catholic notions that the Holy Roman Empire also, and literally symbolizing, constituted. Well, at the outset of the Jubilee, the designated basilicas that we concentrate on in this mini-series, we're talking the ones for the visitation, were St. Peter's in the Vatican and St. Paul's outside the walls, because obviously of the two apostles. St. Paul, an apostle of by election later on, but St. Peter's, of course, as the follower of Christ, as the first pope. But there was also, of course, already the Cathedral of Rome, St. John Lateran, and St. Mary Major, the one in which, Pope Francis just been buried, dedicated, of course, to the Virgin, added to it, right? And this made a lot of sense, because it's as if you added extra power. Again, I don't have to digress, as we have done in other videos dedicated to the topic proper, concerning the actual metaphysical and physical, because it's all one in tradition, influence that the relics, the burials of the saints, the places of martyrdom, really have for those who really, with the right spiritual predisposition, actually visit them, right? But this is all one with the beliefs of the time, were so clear that didn't need even an explanation, like today, unfortunately. So in his Epistolae Familiares 9:13, the famous poet Petrarch vividly outlined the itinerary that a pious traveler was to follow in the Holy City. Petrarch lives in the mid, essentially, in the heart of the 14th century. We will come back on this figure as well, because aside from maybe the analysis of a sonnet, that he really didn't really talk too much about him on Schwerpunkt. He is, as you know, the father of humanism, a very internationally European figure, imperial ambassador, papal ambassador, a great historian, properly graphist, a man that was crowned poet, properly as the great ones of classical literature in Rome on the Capitol Hill. So much so that he, in fact, followed himself the itinerary that had been established for the Jubilee to these Roman basilicas. And he tells us in these letters of his, quote, "Thus you finally reach Rome, the sovereign and pinnacle of all things, a city that one who has not beheld is bold to praise other cities. Just as the prosperity of the Roman people enhanced the city's splendor, so too will the Jubilee year render it, as never before, spiritually enriching. The pilgrim will visit the apostles' tomb. He will walk upon soil stained red with the holy blood of martyrs. He will gaze upon the likeness of the Lord's face, preserved either in the woman's veil, the Veronica's veil, or depicted on the walls of the mother of all churches, the Acheiropoieta image of the Lateran." Right? Acheiropoieta comes from Greek as a term. It means Acheiros picta. Pictos, that means that is not drawn by hand, so essentially a human hand had not created this. It was not a forgery, but God himself had impressed this. And of course in the Cathedral of Rome, right? So the mother of all churches, St. John Lateran. Of course we will start from that in our journey. Of course St. John Lateran is more important than St. Peter's Basilica, Remember that. That's the most important church in the West. Then Petrarch continues and says, he will step, the pilgrim, into the Sancta Sanctorum, a modest space brimming with divine grace. You know, if you're familiar with Rome and with its Catholic memorabilia, you know perfectly well what we're talking about here. These are the single most important places in the history of mankind, all concentrated like this. And it's incredibly beautiful to even think that this Tuscan poet, in all his might, would literally describe to us, right, something that he could describe to us in the way we would still not in, of course, in the way he will describe is the same we would still see today, regardless of how the city changed. But these things, of course, didn't, because tradition doesn't. Then he continues, he will explore the Vatican and the catacombs of Callistus, filled with the relics of the blessed. He will view the Saviour's crib in Santa Maria Maggiore. He will reflect upon the severed head of the Baptist and the gridiron of Lawrence, right, where the saint was burned alive. Roasted alive, more than else. He will stand where Peter was crucified, and where, with the spilling of Paul's blood, springs of water burst forth, which is St. Paul at the Three Fountains. These are all churches, right? This is where St. Paul, St. Peter's was crucified because he was not a Roman citizen, right? And so he was crucified, by the way, upside down, because he didn't want to do it the same way Christ did, because it was not worth it. And so the Romans, granted this wish, and this was basically the worst, the most insulting way a person could be slain. Whereas Saint Paul was actually a Roman citizen, and so decapitation was the only worth death for him. And where this blood spurted, you have properly the fountains to remember it as sacred springs of holy water. Then Petrarch continues and says, and he will see the site where, marked by summer snow, the foundations of a splendid temple were laid. That is, again, Santa Maria Maggiore, because this is the Virgin's miracle that had snow falling on probably in the mid of August, for the feast of the Virgin, in that spot where the church would be erected. So you understand already from the beginning of the Jubilee tradition. So here we are in the 14th century. All right, we're talking here Pope Boniface VIII, Dante, Petrarch, more or less like a generation after the other. How the pilgrimage, not just pilgrimage in Rome, was already a huge thing since ever, and I can't stress enough, as there are many studies that actually brilliantly show it. Rome was by far the most wanted pilgrimage destination, right? It's not like a Christian in the West was so satisfied with Jerusalem and the holy places in Palestine as much as it would be for the wonder of Rome, right? Rome had always maintained the same centrality for everybody involved, and it was just a marvel to behold. The 7 churches in this sense would be established, not just because, of course, like of the obvious numerological importance connected with the Bible, just like 12, etc. So these are all numerological issues. If anything, we can treat on another occasion. But you know that even just by knowing the Old and the New Testament, what this is about. It's rather important, of course, the fact that these specific churches were chosen and formalized in this pilgrimage already from essentially a medieval tradition that, however, would substantiate itself in another period of European history. Actually, a pretty dramatic one that we insist very often in the interpretation of. A pretty bloody one, pretty destructive one. We're talking the 16th century, right? We often call, like, for example, the 17th century the Iron Age. Like, we look at the 30 Years War, the Iron Century. We look at the 30 Years War, etc. There is a bit of a narrative that the 17th century was one of the worst centuries ever. Actually, the 16th, that is instead often quoted as the century of Renaissance, of the great artists, of the discoveries, etc. It actually was one of the most brutally traumatic. Not even just because of the many wars that were fought and were pretty disturbing. We made so many videos about this, from the Italian wars to the German peasants' one to the conquest of the Americans, etc. Regardless of their glory, the contemporaries were horrified, but mostly by one thing. That was, of course, the Protestant Reformation. That, I think, even just in the hierarchy of, say, events that really changed the world, is disproportionately more important than, for example, the Enlightenment. It was basically just a pretty moderate, say, at least was substantiated ideologically in actually much more moderated ways compared to the ruthless violence that the Protestant Reformation actually achieved. And we tend to think to always speak ill of the French Revolution, even as traditionalists. But what happened in the 16th century, it's not like, the former was okay, but I mean, the premises even for what happened later were basically sowed at this point in history. And it's not a surprise that not just the Counter-Reformation, but also in the previous decades, the meaning of the pilgrimage to Rome after Luther, Calvin, etc., had gained so much meaning for the Catholic world. It was, by the way, not just majoritary, but also actually the most advanced of the era. Right, and if you look even at the spread of Protestantism at its peak historically, it's very much concentrated in the most depressed areas. Right, and the peak was the time of the French wars of religion, and as we've seen very well, the Huguenots were mostly concentrated in southern France, in Occitania, as a matter of fact, and there is always a reason for that, and they lost anyway. In any case, this revered and time-honored tradition that was so eloquently captured by Petrarch during the 1350 Jubilee specifically. Again, 1300, 1325, this was the third Jubilee in 1350. Remember, this is also after the plague. This is the age of Cola di Rienzo. We talked about Charles IV of Bohemia. It's a very peculiar moment. The papacy, by the way, is in Avignon, right? And pretty interesting things are happening in Rome, including the reevaluation of the classics that Petrarch strongly contributed to. Also with Cola di Rienzo, that was also a more, Petrarch was sort of a more elegant, or at least higher figure. Cola di Rienzi was actually also a man, of course, with some important erudition. He Latinized very much the Bohemian court of the Luxembourgs in Prague during his captivity, actually, in the same, which is very interesting. We'll talk more about Rienzi for many reasons. There are also these interesting 19th century coming backs from, the Lohengrin, Tannhäuser, but also, William Tell and then Rienzi, etc. So it's very interesting how the 19th century was also making favors to different figures across cultures. right? Germans were talking about Italians, and Italians were talking about Germans in this sort of epic, heroic, romantic, national sense. And it's very interesting, very, very important, with beautiful music, by the way. That was one of the greatest times in music history. In any case, this beautiful Petrarch's description that we read, and of course there is more of it, served as the inspiration for the celebrated pilgrimage to the 7 churches, organized by a very important saint that I hope at some point we will have the fortune, the privilege of discussing, that I've always been very interested in, which is Saint Philip Neri, San Filippo Neri. We're in the latter half of the 16th century. Regarding this, the establishment properly of the 7 churches pilgrimages. In fact, starting in 1552, think about these years, like we're still in the Italian wars, there's still Charles V around, right? Saint Philip Neri formally coordinated a devotional journey to Rome's most sacred sites. Philip was born in Florence, and he was already a famous, pious person that would become a saint, as a matter of fact, and he had arrived in Rome at the age of 19 in 1534. So think again the time. This guy was born essentially like in the tens, in the mid tens of the 16th century. This is before. It's 10 years before the Battle of Pavia, for example. So it's a pretty early time. I made a video about the Italian wars up to 1525, in fact, and we will surely resume that very important topic in European warfare. Now, after pursuing theological studies at La Sapienza, that, as you know, is the University of Rome, founded, by the way, by Boniface VIII, and the largest in Europe, by the way, still today, and also field of excellence is basically Neri field. Neri experienced a profound spiritual crisis around 1540, right? The reason being an extended period of ascetic discipline. During this time, Neri began visiting Rome's holy places, pilgrimages that would later develop into the structured visits that we know today to the 7 churches. In 1548, while still a layman, Neri established the Confraternity of Pilgrims and Convalescents to aid the infirm. Right, the early modern age is really famous for the establishment of these hospitals. Right, as you know, they existed in parallel to pilgrimage, in particular. To the holy places, Rome had always had these. They were known for, say, at the time of Gregory the Great, like xenodokia in Greek, and the Latinized form of the xenodokia means literally like those that receive the foreigners. Right. I recently made a video about the decline of the Byzantine power in Italy, but really those were also times after the Justinian reconquest, when the centrality of Rome was obviously emphasized in what was in fact a Roman Empire. The early modern age witnesses the need for the establishment of these new confraternities, considering the expansion of urban population, the ever more intertwined socio-economical issues with an ever more global world, like intertwined European economy, financial ups and downs. So this was essentially, as always, historically a welfare program started by the church and through a voluntary commitment. A commitment to the marginalized that persisted after Philip Neri was ordained 3 years later and settled at the church of San Girolamo della Carità near Piazza Farnese, named after the famous noble Roman family that, as you know, hosts in the beautiful palace in the square the French embassy in Rome. And the frescoes inside are fantastic, by the way, and it's a very beautiful place a very interesting one to visit to begin with. So if you go to Rome and you want to step into France, at the same time you can visit the palace. Between 1554 and 1558, Philip Neri founded also the Congregation of the Oratory, which eventually selected the Chiesa Nuova. I'm just using the Italian terms because these are eventually how this institution went down to history. He eventually selected the Chiesa Nuova as the home of the Congregation of the Oratory. The Chiesa Nuova was called like this because it was a church initiated at the same Filippo Neri's urging in 1575. The year of the Jubilee, as you know, it goes by 25, 50, 75, and 00, the 100. The year in which also Philip was, achieved the consecration of the new religious order that he had founded. By this time, this Florentine priest had earned widespread renown because of his deeds, fueled by the popularity of the visits and the admiration manifested towards his work by Pope Pius IV Medici, 1562-64. We'll surely talk about his pontificate. In fact, as you understand from his family of origin, his name, the Pope was a fellow Florentine, just like Philip, as well as the Cardinals Borromeo and Paleotti were. Right, these were very famous figures in the age of Counter-Reformation, Council of Trent. We will talk about these individuals because at this time they even risked their lives at the service of the church. This was a very delicate moment in the Renaissance because of the interconfessional clashes, but also great rivalries within the same, also these levels of ecclesiastical power. All these figures, the Pope, these cardinals, eagerly sought to have the Oratorians establish communities in their cities that were respectively and famously enough Cardinal Borromeo Milan and Cardinal Paleotti Bologna. Right, these two cities, by the way, were so important from just a historical, strategical, and political standpoint. Milan was the most important city held by the Spanish in the Holy Roman Empire, and by far the center of the most advanced and richer Habsburgic-controlled part of Italy. You know, the Duchy of Milan, during the Italian Wars, was entirely taken over. Right, it wasn't like, I don't know, Tuscany or Venice or Savoy or the same Papal States that technically were run on their own, right? Even if they were tendentially aligned with the Habsburgs. And Bologna, that instead was the major Papal States center north of the Apennines in the Po Valley, and quite important city historically also because of the local university, and one that had even gained more renown in the Papal Imperial relations because basically the Pope had managed to annexate that area. It was basically also this Emilia-Romagna had historically included Ravenna in the east of Bologna as you've seen, especially in our videos about the early medieval Italian church, had competed with Rome, and later was a territory that the Pope contended to the Emperor, right, quite fiercely. And it's under Rudolf of Habsburg, basically, that this land was given for good to the papacy by from the King of the Romans in exchange for the recognition of his crown. These are also, of course, times in which the Habsburgs, especially after all the issues of the sack of Rome and some sort of unfortunate papal and also imperial policy, had really been one another. At this point, they're very sound allies, and frankly, under the Spanish, Italy lived a moment of great economical well-being, like a pacification. It wasn't actually like the dark legend version, like of the Spanish as the terrible oppressors, the papacy being hegemonic with the Inquisition. Like, things were, say, in Italy going pretty well after all, especially after the Italian wars had shifted towards the Flemish theater of war. Italy would have 150 years of peace, basically, a pretty consistent one overall. There was some clash here and there, but at large, it went fairly well until essentially the War of Spanish Succession. Yes, there was the plague at some point during the 30 Years' War. There's also the famous Manzonian description of the same. But all in all, right, these were fairly stable times, to say the least. The honor of the consecration of this order was extended to only to Naples, where the friars, led by Neri's devoted disciple Tarugi, settled in the Seripando Palace near the Neapolitan Cathedral. Of course, Naples instead was, I was saying Italy before, I mean in central northern Italy. The Spanish controlled Naples for quite a while, and Naples, one of the greatest cities in Europe, as a matter of fact. Again, very, also for these times, properly prosper, and we often forget sort of that part of Europe, as if, I don't know, Italy was always in some perpetually decadent phases. It's not really what happened. In any case, this Catholic connection was very solid. And especially in Italy, you consider that Italy was the only country in Europe that never had a confessional war, a war of religion whatsoever. So it's very, very, very interesting, because the French would be killing one another, the Germans were killing one another, the English, even the Spanish at home had problem with the Moriscos, etc. Like, Italy was uniformly Catholic, aside from some edgy nobleman / intellectual that turned to Protestantism. Like, the entire establishment, the entire system was Catholic, and there was never any issue whatsoever. Of course, this was not merely a national theater. In fact, Italy was the same symbol of the Counter-Reformation, and the work of figures like Philip Neri stand out exactly in this, also against this international background. The fervor surrounding the Oratorians largely stemmed from the leniency of their regulations. In fact, unlike the Jesuits, that, as you know, had been established just to safeguard Catholicism in essentially a paramilitary fashion, disciplinarily speaking, Oratorians were not bound by vows of poverty or obedience, nor were they compelled under penalty of mortal sin to adhere to the order's rules, which they could leave at any time with ease. This is as if the Oratorians of Neri were the tertio, right? It's said that in the Spanish, also in the Italian, the German, etc., tercio, the notion was that nobody imposed discipline because it was such a privilege to be part of this, and your commitment to the cause, to the Catholic cause, the imperial cause, the Spanish, whatever, was so strong that just abandoning the tercio, you would have been disgraced forever, right? This is also the tercio was a military unit. The Oratorians were again something different, and Philip Neri had created them exactly to render these forms of religious participation, counter-reformistic statements, to more people, right? Philip Neri was especially very close to children. He saved so many from the streets, and especially in those times where, again, as I was saying before, there were ever more hospitals. The early modern age is a moment in which people don't want to see beggars in the streets anymore, like it would have been normal during the Middle Ages. At this point, you really have to take care of these communities also as much more systemically present ones, right? And the church, again, has an enormous merit in this control, right? In giving properly an education, a chance to other people. And it's weird, in fact, how people think that, I don't know, even the Inquisition was something so terrible. It was actually the most guarantistic tribunal in Europe. Like, if you ended up in the hands, not even of the Protestants, would have burned you on the spot, as they kept doing until the 18th century. But even if you had looked at secular justice, like in all the countries in Europe, and especially also in the least, tendenциally also in the ones, the least developed countries, the Protestant background, they simply killed so many more people, also sometimes without fair trial or any proof, etc. The Inquisition was an incredibly serious tribunal, was by far the most advanced, most guarantistic of the inquired individuals' rights, right? Which, again, literally many people think the Inquisition is just evil incarnated. They literally do not know anything about the historiography existing on the Inquisition by all the most updated standards all over the West, right? So I don't know honestly how long we can go around like this. In any case, we will surely also talk about the Inquisition at some point to explain this better. People loved the Inquisition. This is also the point. In any case, Philip Neri's guiding principles in the Oratorians were humility, dedicated scholarship, brotherly camaraderie, and joy, right? Not mere amusement, but a tranquil confidence in one's fate and identity. This perspective illuminates mystical texts such as State Allegri, which in Italian means be joyful. So remain, also be in the sense of like being, really affirm yourself in this condition, joyful. And the dialogue of Christian joy, as well as the many initiatives that Neri championed, nearly all of which stood in contrast to the era's relatively uninspired piety, or at least something that had to be reinforced surely in the wake of tradition, but not necessarily because of the spontaneous expression of the faithful and the enjoyment of this congregation. These were, by the way, outdoor religious activities, blending solemn contemplation with intervals of music and leisure. Such events drew not only ordinary folk, but also prominent and distinguished individuals captivated by the zeal and authenticity of Philip's faith, which broke through societal conventions. The same ethos permeated the so-called pilgrimage to the seven churches, which is the most enduring of the saints' religious endeavors. So what happens today during the Jubilee is actually part of the embracement that the papacy made of this fairly unconventional saint that really connected with the people, connected with the streets, connected with the local communities, right, in ways that were even ever more, as we will see now, tied to, in this case, to Rome, but properly to the holy places of that people could access. This is a beautiful concept behind that, the fact that the this pilgrimage is not merely a matter of duty or something that you have to do to earn points in front of God, but it's truly something that you can enjoy, just like visiting these beautiful churches, because of the happiness, of the joy of being there, of being capable of admiring these marvels and feeling all the divine connection through the relics, through the imagery, through the symbol that the church is. Now, begun by Neri in the 40s of the 16th century, initially alone or with a handful of trusted followers, the pilgrimage became a regular and organized practice by 1559. Covering 16 miles over 2 days, it typically encompassed the churches of St. Peter's, St. Paul's outside the walls, St. Sebastian, St. John Lateran, the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, Santa Croce in Jerusalem. These are all the basilicas. San Lorenzo fuori le mura, St. Lawrence outside the wall, and St. Mary Major, Santa Maria Maggiore. You understand also how extensive really this tour was, right? So it's something that you're supposed to do, of course, in you can do it in a day, of course, but it's also something that is meant to take its time, a time that contemplates also passing through the city, right? And so even though there is a specific connection with these main churches, still what you see, what you find by visiting, by crossing the city to reach a point to another, is properly getting to know the city itself to some important detail and being able to locate various basilicas amidst like the size of the city after all. Because Rome was definitely important and very much, Voltaire makes a beautiful description of Rome and what it looked like. It was really impressive in the 16th century, like as it is, say, today, if you want, but even as a city at the time, right? Had it been just that, it was, from a material point of view, it would have been enormous. Consider that St. Peter's Basilica, as we know it, was being built at this point. So it's really a great moment in the history of Catholicism, regardless of the crisis. It was the pushback, the capacity to regain control over many swathes of Europe, also through warfare and through the holy guiding of the church as allies and armies. Occasionally, the route across Rome also saw minor adjustments depending on different factors. For example, if restoration work made a customary stop inaccessible, it was substituted. Right, restoration work, as we're saying here, were very important. Some basilicas were being remade, literally. And a very important church was coming as a, you can't visit one of those basilicas, then you could use, not always, but often, or even usually, the minor basilica of Santa Maria in Trastevere, which is also a medieval masterpiece, as you know. It's one of the most beautiful churches in the world. Now, the pilgrimage's success quickly provoked envy, doubt, and slander, particularly targeting Neri's limited formal theological training, as he had forsaken academic pursuits in his youth to embrace his apostolic mission. He did not really opt for a career, but he ended up winning a very high position, a sort of Saint Francis, right, of the era. Like some would decide to leave his Christo mimesis in this form, in this way, right? But there were conflicts, as we just stated, sparking in turn a sharp rhetorical clash with a fervent prelate like Philip, leading to a severe rebuke from the Pope as well, given that the pontiff was apparently misinformed about the priest's integrity, with all these voices that did not really like his doing, his ways, because they were out of the ordinary, out of the, let's say, also think about how the crowds were being won by Neri, and how important this was in a clienterly world like that one. In fact, the substance of these accusations was scarce, and after a brief period of penance that was required anyhow by the Pope, showing that a regulation was needed, and so that Neri had to align to some specific guideline, Philip resumed his pilgrimages unhindered, joined, by the way, by an increasingly large and enthusiastic following. The enduring appeal of this initiative remains evident even today. That is to say, Neri, a fervent advocate for blending the sacred with the pleasurable, skillfully wove devotion to martyred saints with the charm of the artistic and archaeological wonders encountered en route. This is, as I was saying just before, what we can all easily agree on, right? Visiting Rome, following this path, is unlike another experience. You can, of course, cross Rome far and wide, especially the historical centuries, perfect for walking across it in this way. But it's never the same, considering all the various combinations, of course, that inherently contain the difference. However, in the way the path through the seven basilicas is concerned, not just because of the meaning behind it, that is, of course, all one with it, ends up being all one with it, but also just because of these specific coordinates, right? The specific mission, task, and what you are truly going to leave in that order, right, in along the way. The lengthy trek, as we've seen, 16 miles, was frequently eased by songs and prayers, punctuated by prolonged moments of reflection and quiet. Think about this tempo, this rhythm, right? It's more than it is a pilgrimage, right? It's a spiritual journey, but it's tempered, it's adjusted, it's supposed to make you think, right? It's just like a tour, a journey that you need to savor, but also that provides you with food for thought, has to make you reflect. It has to be enjoyable, but it also has to be didactic in so many ways, and of course spiritually uplifting. Consequently, contemporaries saw the warning of the Song of Vanities, that is, vanity of vanities, everything is vanity, all the world is what it has, everything is vanity, right? Interwoven with the fond recollection of a pastoral excursion amid Rome's most stirring relics, culminating in a repast at Villa Mattei. Designed as a counterpoint to the raucous and lively Roman carnival, the pilgrimage to the seven churches commenced on Ash Wednesday, participants were organized into groups of 100, led by a cross borne by the Capuchin fathers, followed by youths, clergy, oratory brothers, men, and finally women. Always remember the traditional awareness of virility as the cornerstone of tradition, as the leadership of tradition, that the women necessarily also complemented. I explained it very, very precisely in the and fulfilled, for that matter, in the video about Erec et Enid by Chrétien de Troyes. Right. By the way, this pilgrimage to Rome was, of course, destined to an international people. Right. So this was obviously always considered as a framework, a right, part of the broader Catholic tradition, and the reinforcement of the same after the Protestant Reformation. Now, by evening, this varied procession assembled before the Oratorians' base, first San Girolamo della Carità, later Santa Maria in Vallicella, and proceeded to St. Peter's, crossing the Tiber via Ponte Sant'Angelo and traversing the Borgo. All right. So this is, what the path is, because, the Borgo was essentially this quarter that existed before fascism, as basically Mussolini tore it down to like the imperial fort, etc. That led to, from in fact, Castle Saint Angel, the Tiber, to the Vatican Basilica, just like it had been rebuilt, like in the form we see here. The old St. Peter was beautiful, by the way. If you look at the plant, I also often use this for in my videos about the High Middle Ages, the later Middle Ages. We will probably make a video about this too, because again, there is an incredible revival, probably also of Roman architecture. As you know, during the Renaissance, great part of what was medieval Rome, for better or for worse, went lost, right? There are just some parts of Rome, some are immense, in meaning and size. There are some medieval buildings that are actually bigger than the most famous Roman monuments, but few people care about that, even though they're just next to them. But there were houses, like what is today Via della Conciliazione, between the Vatican Basilica and the river. There were houses, so that until the 20th century you would essentially come out, as it often happens in other areas of Rome today and at the time, two beautiful squares just passing through narrow streets that were a bit just like the medieval ones you can see in some other cities in Europe. Italy, central Italy, has a lot of those still there, right? Especially in Umbria and Tuscany, but you know what I'm talking about. We'll also come back on a bit of medieval urbanistics, because realizing the differences, the styles, also the people, just how the people lived there is very, very important. And thinking in the sense how intimate this crossing of Rome really was, and how picturesque this procession was. So after visiting the Vatican Basilica, the group paused briefly at the 15th century Santo Spirito in Sassia Hospital, taking the name after the Anglo-Saxon collegium that existed there since early medieval times, like a veritable guild of Saxons that also took up arms to defend even the basilicas, St. Paul, St. Peter, during the Saracen raids of the 9th century in Carolingian times, for example. And in this 15th century hospital, it is called again Insassia because it was like in Saxony, in theory, because there were the Saxons there. In keeping with the Oratorian congregation's charitable ethos, the group again visited the sick. And again, remembered how the congregation had been born, right? So, with the first leg complete, the large entourage dispersed, right? Because they literally had the night free, so to say, and so because it was again a very committing thing, and they would regroup the next day. It's just like guided tours in Rome. Like you have the program in the day, and then in the night, well, you go have fun, right? Now on Thursday morning, exiting the Leonine walls through Porta Santo Spirito, pilgrims followed Via della Lungara. It's a very picturesque street, passing through the Trastevere Gardens. So we are on the other side of the river, because remember, this is where also, in fact, the Vatican Basilica is located, as you know, historically. And they would reach Porta Settimania to reach the river again. And in fact, the Tiberine Island, the very beautiful island on the Tiber in the center of Rome. And there, after marveling at the quaint church of St. Bartolomeo all'Isola, St. Bartholomew on the island, that was located, by the way, on a sanctuary to Aesculapius, dating back to Roman classical times, but centuries before Christ. It was incredibly old, right? Because it was said that a snake, also a sacred snake to Aesculapius, settled there, and St. Bartholomew hosted also a hospital. In fact, today, still on the island, would you look at the main building, there is actually a big hospital there. Remember, that dates to literally ancient Roman times. The group crossed the river to the pass on the island through the two bridges, and connecting the two banks, entering at that point the Velabrum and the Circus Maximus area. So this region today, as you know, still boasts remarkable classical remnants, to say the least, including, by the way, the theatre of Marcellus, that, by the way, had historically turned into a fortress in the Middle Ages, and is still, there were houses, you can still see them today on the top level, and it's incredible. Naturally, everything is dramatically exploded in price, that these are veritable fortunes just to own. The Ark of Janus, that is basically the cornerstone of the universe, not just of Rome. And we will talk about that, because there is a massive theology about the Ark of Janus. Like a massive theology. Like it's the Ark of Janus is more important than the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, foundationally speaking. The Temple of Portunus, other very important deity that we will talk about some other time. Then the circular temple of Hercules Victor, also known as Olivarius because of the Forum Olivarium, where literally olives were sold there, were marketed in ancient times. You know, those are very famous, very central parts of Rome. And alongside, you would have, in fact, key Christian sites as masterpieces in the history of art and, architecture. That is San Nicola in Carcere, San Giorgio, and Santa Maria in Cosmedin. That are, of course, all worth a visit, to say the least. From there, the pilgrims climbed the Aventine Hill on the river, briefly glancing at the pyramid of Cestius before taking the Via Ostiense, the road for Ostia, in fact down river, to arrive swiftly, in fact, there at St. Paul's outside the walls, because of course we are outside the Aurelian walls, all right? This is where the early Christian basilicas were founded, because it was not legal initially, of course, for Christians to erect them inside the urbs. Departing the majestic fort, this was the patrimony of St. Peter. So that's why it's of course, this was Papal States at the time, and nobody, there was no risk, but historically, this, as long as also there was probably a lay authority, or a temporal authority, ideally separated from a spiritual one. Of course, these were massive foundations. We explained it in the first video. Basilicas were just a massive asset, to say the least, all endowed with privileges, exemptions by the same emperor. We will talk more and better how the church got to own this marbles, these jewels that she in fact contributed also to enrich through the sheer prestige that they owned. Departing the majestic 4th century basilica, which retained its splendid original form until 1823, so pretty late in time, the pilgrims embarked on an extended journey beyond the city. Right? In fact, the path that is still known in the Roman street there in Italian as Via delle Sette Chiese, so literally the street, the road of the 7 churches, differed vastly from its modern urbanized state that you can see, because of course this is the end of the so-called historical center, but the center of Rome extends beyond that. So until the last century, those on the pilgrimage heading towards the Appian Way, departing for the south, traversed a breathtaking rural landscape framed by the nearly intact Aurelian walls, especially there, and the evocative ruins of imperial aqueducts. There are many beautiful and famous Roman landscapes by artists of all kind, and the words of Petrarch were echoed by Goethe as well. He's a fool who praises other cities without having visited Rome, by the way. And of course, outside the space, Rome had villas, so estates, a rural or semi-rural reality, because the countryside began more or less from there. Yet, even in that more bucolic landscape, you would have things like literally the Aurelian walls, inside imperial aqueducts, ruins. This was the grandeur of Rome presented, inspiring so many artists from a vividly graphic point of view. One can readily envision the exalted spirit with which pilgrims would arrive at the next stop, the Church of Saint Sebastian, to which Filippo Neri was profoundly devoted. Why? Because he had experienced a vision of a fiery globe in the nearby catacombs during his youth. Right? And the fiery globe, of course, was a symbol of the transfiguration of the world, right, through divine power. As lunchtime neared, one can picture the faithful, especially consider this is happening, as you understand, here in springtime, like during Easter, right, that Lent, and so just imagine like the mild central Italian weather. At this point, you could literally like make a picnic in these areas. And So after this rural post, looks like this more unplanned air side, the group would hasten slightly toward the city, right? With the mystical, like with the mass, with the as we've seen, like the general surroundings. The usual dining spot, however, would rather be or become also the villa of Ciriaco Mattei, that is today known as Villa Celimontana, perched at atop the Celian Hill, so basically next to the to the Palatine, to the Aventine. Ciriaco Mattei, by the way, was nobleman living at the time. He died in 1614. He was born in 1545 in Rome. He was a famous Italian art collectionist and patron of Caravaggio during his period of permanence in Rome that provided us, in fact, with some enormous masterpieces, as you know, pictorially speaking. Befitting a pilgrimage of contemplation and prayer, the meal for the procession was simple. Still, with thousands in attendance, this segment posed a significant logistical challenge for the Oratorian friars that had to provide with the actual food for everyone. Beneath ancient pines and cypresses, because as you know, it's still like this, and on the Celian Hill, and this is beautiful, especially in the Villa Celimontana. There is a beautiful site, beautiful spot, and the pose was even enlivened by a small orchestra, while those inclined could visit the magnificent churches of Santo Stefano Rotondo, Santa Maria in Dominica, and the saints, the Santi Giovanni and Paolo. Again, imagine all the people that were there, and I think this as a really happy brigade, is some sort of Boccaccio's vision, all right, but surely permeated with a very strong sense of devotion and true joy for this beautiful tour of Rome, among the other things. Following this respite, the journey continued, passing San Sisto Vecchio and Sant'Inerio and Achilleo. These are minor, but actually, like, we can't even say what's minor here in terms of monuments, churches in these places. Rome, again, like most places in Europe, but this one in particular, like, it's worth literally like stopping every step of the way, because literally you stumble into something ever bigger than the rest. In any case, this path led, if you're familiar with the area, to, and you spot the direction, until St. John Lateran, the Cathedral of Rome, right? This was visited with a brief but essential visit to the Holy Ladder as well, which is essential, really appropriate. A short distance further brought pilgrims to Santa Croce in Jerusalem, the fifth stop, if you counted it, where the group prayed before one of Rome's most revered relics, that is the one of the true cross, right? Departing the Caesarean Basilica, the procession exited the city walls once again, through Porta Maggiore, heading towards St. Lawrence outside the walls along the Tiburtina road. We're in the east of Rome, all right? And it's all reachable by foot, right? But it's quite a tour, especially considering that you have to do other things In the meanwhle, you have to stop, you have to devote yourself. There are all these poses, so it is actually a pretty intense journey. In fact, reaching the site of St. Lawrence at dusk, the weary pilgrims re-entered the city center, passing Santa Prassede before concluding. These are all incredibly important churches in Rome, by the way, but before concluding at the final destination, that is Santa Maria Maggiore, again, where Pope Francis was recently buried. From the latter half of the 16th century, so this was complete, right? So this pilgrimage to the 7 churches enjoyed steadily increasing success. Participation peaked during the pontificate of Pius IV Medici that we mentioned before. We're in the early 60s of the 16th century, with over 6,000 attendees. Right? Consider that we're talking pre-industrial world, so it's not too much, but you could count these people and being willing to do so. And through, of course, a ritual that is no more, but let's say in theory you should actually follow the same path. And so it's not like Filippo Neri envisaged it, but it was still concretely, it's still concretely performable. And so this practice, before, in fact, disappearing, remained actually strong for another couple of centuries, or more, actually. The main reason why it was over, it was that the Italian government, amid the tense political climate with the papacy following the unification, and especially we have seen it in the recent video about Wilhelm Stieber, as far as the fact that, as you know, the Italians that had already taken over basically almost the entire peninsula, in fact, conquered Rome, right, with a military force, because the French guard of the papacy had been recalled to home to defend from the Prussian invasion, eventually, probably the seizure of Paris, and eventually also the unification of Germany that occurred in that sense 10 years after the Italian one of the Kingdom of Italy, but that was the latter which was crowned by the annexation of Rome, right, in pretty tense relations with the papacy that, as you know, would not be solved until Mussolini's times, with the Lateran Pacts that still regulate the relations between, the very intimate relations between the Italian government and the Vatican City. Pretty intense one. It's like if you have heard, if you have watched, if anything, yesterday's Pope Leo XIV's elections ceremony. You hear that there is the Italian national anthem sung together with the papal blessing. They will be at Orbi, like from the like as he presents himself to Rome, to the world, thus from the lodge of the benedictions. And this is all because of what was regulated at the time. So actually what put an end to the ritual performance of the pilgrimage to the 7 churches. This is very important because, as I was saying before, it's just this traditional practices ended pretty late in time, right? And because of these acts of force from the side of more lay powers, was suspended in 1870. That was the year, right? And this interruption, however, was intended as merely a concession to raison d'etat, right? In fact, as soon as relations with the Holy See allowed, because literally the Italian state had simply said that, okay, well, this is a provisional issue. We will not let you do it, because you know what happened. Like the Vatican City remained the Vatican City. The rest was Italy, just like it is today in Rome, right? So that was the point. The visit to the 7 churches had to be organized in a space that, if anything, especially the church that had felt violated, the papacy had felt violated, would not concede to the Italian state, rather. All right, so it was a pretty mutual issue. That at the Victorian monument in Rome, what the Savoy did was reinstalling the, as you can see on the top of the monument, literally the figure of the winged glory that the church had removed from the saint at the time of Theodosius, of St. Ambrose. So that was pretty eloquent in itself, even though the winged glory symbolism, as you know, lived very well into Christianity till today. And in fact, what is very important about Saint Filippo Neri, is that he was actually canonized in a time of close to the Lateran Pacts. It would have occurred later, but in a moment in which essentially that reconvergence between Italian state and the papacy returned. Right, it occurred in 1922, fatal year, because basically this is when Mussolini was, as you know, fascism was coming to power. In any case, this is also not quite the reason per se. It's just like looking at the historical tempers and realizing when these things happen. I made some videos about Italian. I think one video about Italian fascism, mostly during the 1930s, but it kind of gives you a gist of what we're talking about, also in terms of the relations with the church, which still remained very, this is a contract between two separated realities, of course. It can't be otherwise. I mean, church and state are separated in Christianity by definition, right? People want to make you believe it's a modern thing. It's not, right? What is a modern thing is properly saying that your state becomes atheist. The church was always separated metaphysically from any state on earth since Christ, all right? In the visit to the 7 churches is still a thing, right? Especially after the canonization of Filippo Neri, because of his memory. The devout journey swiftly regained its traditional cadence, including the picnic at Villa Mattei, as a matter of fact. So this is actually a very beautiful, sketch of how this world would literally live and pullulate with such old history that, as you understand, is not merely old because of a medieval tradition, the pontificate of Boniface VIII, the times of Petrarch, or even just the one of the Counter-Reformation. It is because this informs a tradition that is much older. That, as you know, it lived even within those that we erroneously call pagan temples, that the same visit to the 7 churches entailed, because the meaning of the same, the power of the same, would actually remain throughout the centuries as a support for what was a univocally Catholic tradition, right? So this video, I think, can be very useful also for anyone who is interested in a sketchy realization of what essentially the pilgrimage to the 7 churches during the Jubilee is concerned. Also talking a bit the figure of Filippo Neri, which is incredibly important, and not just for this. We focus mostly on this, but it's not only this, or not even just this, and the general tradition that Rome offers on a regular basis, in ways that can't quite just pass, barely noticed, right? It's a huge thing. It really expresses the power of tradition in all what this truly entails, right? So for today, however, I stop it here. We will keep talking about the 7 churches, the 7 basilicas. For today, just to stop it here. Hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.